Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Talking TWAMPs. If you listened to our last episode on midterm predictions, you may have noticed that the ending was somewhat abrupt. This is because after the last comments you heard, we got a little bit off track and talked for almost a full extra hour on midterm strategies and the consequences for future elections. Because a lot of that conversation ended up being interesting in its own right, I've gone and edited much of it into the episode you're about to listen to. Be forewarned that you will hear some of the same abruptness as we had to move from section to section to make the episode have a logical theme to it. Nevertheless, it is interesting, and I hope that you enjoy listening to it as much as we all did talking about it. Here it is.
I think it's important to note the handful of races that we pointed out here and what may distinguish them from those situations, namely the sort of platforms that the candidates were running on. O'Rourke is not what we would consider a sort of Texas Hardy Democrat in terms of his platform. I mean, maybe his demographics. He's a straight white male in his mid, I think, 50s or 40s, somewhere in there.
Doesn't look like it at all.
No, he didn't look it, but that's just the case.
He's got dad bod.
Yeah, and
He's got spunk.
yes, he does. And so to that end, the fact that he was running on a rather progressive platform doesn't seem to have flagged him among independents. In fact, it seems to have helped him, marginally speaking. Of course, he didn't win, but he picked up a larger margin of independents than he was expected to pick up. And I think we're looking at the same thing in a lot of other cases where Democrats took on a rather progressive stance for the area that really should not have helped them. I think the solid counterpoint is the Kentucky 6th, which we saw a lot of polls putting neither candidate above 50%, but at the same time expecting the Democrat to eke out a sort of marginal victory. The same way that Pennsylvania, Hillary Clinton was never above 50%, but was expected to eke out a marginal victory. As far as I understand her platform, and it's entirely possible that I'm misquoting her, but McGrath, who was the Democrat running in Kentucky 6th, adopted a rather moderate / pseudo-conservative Democratic platform, a nearly pro-gun stance. And that's the sort of thing, what I'm there, as a sort of collection to my thoughts there, my conclusion is that in order to pick up the independents, not the independents, but the undecideds, what you need to be doing is not running to the moderate, to the middle point. I think that undecideds are not voting for a candidate because they don't see them taking an actually strong stance one way or the other. And so in order to pick up those undecided voters, what the candidates on either side really need to be doing is running to their respective somewhat more radical platforms, which I am not happy about, but is the truth.
Well, this brings us to another good point about the error in polling data, which is that it doesn't consider what kind of candidates are running. O'Rourke overperformed his polls. McGrath underperformed her polls in a way that pundits found very hard to predict because systematic study of this is really difficult. It's really difficult to quantify what exactly someone's position is as kind of a numerical slider that you can just work into a model. And that is, I think, somewhere where pundits are necessary and are really kind of dropping the ball in really effectively looking at these particular factors.
Well, and it doesn't help that but prior to 2016, the pundits didn't really have a reason to think about what they were saying. For demographic reasons, the fact that Obama was going to take some states on the margin was kind of a given, because the undecided voter, was a little bit overwhelmed by the ridiculously high minority vote turnout, which was going to go for Obama. And in the same way, the Republican gains in the House and Senate were predictable based on historical patterns for a president the opposing party taking the legislature while a president continues to sit. And I think that may have made them a little soft in terms of actually analyzing the polling data that they're receiving. Not to mention, Fox has made us particularly used to, and then CNN's capitulation to start looking more like Fox made us much more used to the idea of big flashy graphics and ticker tape along the bottom of how quickly can a pundit tell me something, not how accurate are they when they tell me.
I want to look at Georgia. That's where my area of interest is. I'm from Atlanta.
Speaking of selection bias.
So I called Macbeth as winning, which was correct. But the more interesting one, I think, is Abrams. Abrams...
Who has not conceded, by the way. She's still waiting for all those recounts.
Yes. But she definitely lost. And all questionable electoral practices aside, I think it's worth looking at the demographics of Atlanta and turnout in Atlanta. So the current census estimates for Atlanta's growth in 2018 they have a population around 46,000, I think. That number is somewhere around there. I wouldn't be surprised. Atlanta has grown very quickly and a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers were upwards of 600,000 when the census comes out in 2020. And a lot of that is Democratic voting. I think the hold there, I think that can have a large influence on the state level outcomes, on Georgia pushing bluer and bluer because you have this huge center of Democratic gravity in Atlanta and smaller centers outside in like Columbus and Athens. But I think the thing that preventing that from truly taking form is the turnout issues. Cities are inherently less likely to turn out. They're much harder to turn people out, especially in minority communities. They're a lot harder to turn out than rural and white communities.
Abe, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to talk about something else in regard to this. We saw last Tuesday that for moderate Democrats, they were overall very successful. Progressives, not so much. And a lot of that has been tied back to the audience that progressives have gone after and the audience that moderate Democrats have gone after. And that all roots back to this sort of idea that's been circulating amongst the Democrats' voting ideology or voting strategy for a while, which is the win the minorities to overpower the majority white male that would vote Republican. And I think we saw on Tuesday, my assertion is that we saw that still does not work.
Okay, so let me...
I'd like to play devil's advocate a little. No, not on an ideological level.
Well, I want to explain my sources for that. One, I'm using a CNN report and a New York Times report regarding the progressives and the moderates about where they did not win, that they were statistically just underperformed. And I want to point to Florida, where Gillum very much, and Georgia as well, where they both had this, we are going to get the minorities to vote Democrat to overpower rather than appealing more towards the middle. So, go. Okay,
so a couple of caveats there. One, if the Democrats ever did truly espouse that strategy for the House level, it would be beyond stupid. Because even though this country has in very recent history created a minority majority in terms of white Caucasian versus all of the, I think right now Caucasians at 46% of the nation or something to that effect. Either way, it's under 50%. That's not demographically the case in almost every county in this country. The minority pooling in major cities is so drastic to the point at which I don't think Democrats have ever truly honestly espoused that tactic when it comes to... I think that
is absolutely but what they have been espousing in Senate, governor, and presidential elections.
Well, so that's what I'm saying. Only in those state... So when you're talking about... If CNN or Times are pointing to those strategies failing on the House level, that is out entirely because that cannot be the strategy and won't be a viable strategy for at least another 100 years.
I'd like to add something, which is that when we're connecting the minority mobilization strategy to a particularly progressive set of candidates, I'd like to say that the kind of counterpoint to that is in Vermont and much of the Pacific, or much of the Atlantic Northeast, which is overwhelmingly, with the exception of New York and New Jersey metropolitan areas, white, but also sees the most progressive Democratic candidates who mobilize largely white populations. When we're talking about a minority mobilization strategy, I think what we're missing here is that the value of it is not that it is an alternative, like they're making a choice between the two strategies, but rather that they're choosing this strategy in areas in which the other strategy is not and has never been viable. So take Texas, for instance. Democrats in Texas, it has been proven again and again, and it was actually proven this election cycle that Democrats cannot take the strategy that you're suggesting is better, the appeal broadly to everybody strategy and try to eat away at Republican margins. In the comparison between O'Rourke and who was the gubernatorial candidate?
Abbott or Valkit, something like that.
So the gubernatorial candidate for the Democrats ran on a very moderate platform compared to O'Rourke. This is a state-level election, and the two candidates were highly connected together on the state level. And yet, O'Rourke vastly outperformed Texas's Democratic gubernatorial candidate because he was able to use this mobilization strategy. Now, I'm not saying that this mobilization strategy is universally applicable. For instance, Elaine Luria, who won our district, could not have used it because of the way the district is formed. It's heavily gerrymandered, to be frank, but it's vastly white compared to the overall demographics of the surrounding area. But in areas where Democrats are making marginal gains, it is because of this strategy, and I think O'Rourke kind of demonstrates that very strongly.
And I think the other thing that, and I've not read these CNN or New York Times reports, but...
Let me pull it up.
Okay. But I think the other thing that they may or may not be taking into account is if they're only because again, we've discounted this as a criticism that can be leveled at the House election level. It's simply not the case that the minority strategy is what the House Democrats have used, because it's not usable across most of the country. But if then we're only looking at gubernatorial, senatorial, and presidential elections, then I'd like to take a look at the places where Democrats lost areas that could be considered, places where the minority turnout would have made a difference. And that, I think Atlanta and Florida are both, Georgia and Florida are both great case studies for that, where we did see the Democrat lose, even though there should have been a high minority turnout. And I think that two things that we can almost concretely point to for being explanations rather than turnout are mass disenfranchisement. I mean, the one thing that did pass in Florida is a ballot measure that just put 1.5 million more voters onto the Florida voter rolls by re-enfranchising felons, or at least certain classes of felons. And I think that's going to drastically change how Florida elections play out, as long as they don't do what happened in Georgia, which is to start throwing out minority voters for related name-based issues and or failure to vote in previous elections, and then rather lackluster notification systems. And so I think that unless the New York Times and CNN took those things into account, at best this is just another thing where pundits are pointing to one level of percentages and then just moving on. Joe?
Hot take. Voters do not care whatsoever about ideology in the way that we as, let's say it, coastal elitists discuss it. I would have to see the articles that you're discussing, Ryan, but I don't think that there is from what I've seen, I don't think that there's a solid argument to be made that the dividing line between Democrats who succeeded and Democrats who failed was their progressiveness or lack thereof. I guess the examples you could bring up for that are the ones that have already gone, like Florida, where Gillum underperformed Nelson. Though, and I hate to say this, I would say that race had a lot more to do with that than their relative positions as progressive and moderates. Elsewhere in the country, and this is the bias I have towards a particular region of the country to be more interested in, but elsewhere in the country, I think there's evidence of the opposite trend. Ohio, I suppose, is a good example in which Cordray ran as a moderate. Brown is perfect in every way.
And
a
populist
is the phrase I mean to use.
And of course, the High Plains governorship of Wyoming.
Hang on, I would like to directly disagree with Joe on this. I think.
Ouch.
Okay. I know that you are from Ohio, so if I were to ever duel you in Ohio geography or anything like that, I would probably lose or something like that. But Cordray was backed by Warren and progressives across the country. He was the progressive Ohio candidate, far more than Brown was. And Cordray lost while DeWine won, appealing to a more moderate Republican base. Cordray was the progressive in Ohio who lost. Gillum is the progressive in Florida who lost. Abrams was the progressive in Georgia who lost. They were
right, but we've offered mitigating circumstances for both Abrams and Gillum, namely Gillum's race and Abrams' racial inability to get out black voters that had been massively disadvantaged.
I'm not saying that the only reason that these candidates lost is because of their progressiveness, but you saw across the board that the high-profile progressive progressive candidates did not win out on the races that they were either predicted to win or had a greater chance than, or had a.
I think the problem is with your definition of what defines progressiveness then, because Cordray was very much, I mean, compared to DeWine, sure, you could call him progressive, but being endorsed by out-of-state people like Warren does not make him the most, the quote-unquote progressive candidate. The progressive candidate, quote-unquote, the quote-unquote progressive candidate in that race was Dennis Kucinich, who got wiped out in the Democrat primary. We can talk about minutia all day long, but I think the key distinction that is important is a cross-party appeal strategy, which you could call a moderate strategy, versus a turnout strategy, which you might also call a populist strategy. I think that what you should look at is candidates who put a lot of effort into appealing across the aisle did a lot worse than candidates who put a lot of effort into inspiring people who didn't turn out anyway, who didn't turn out to turn out. To mobilize their own voters.
Can you say that you're saying that the candidates who won on Tuesday night were
let's say overperformed.
Who overperformed were only the candidates who appealed mainly to their side rather than trying to either reach to the other side or reach to undecided voters?
I think if we are going to take a lesson out of this, it is that the mobilization strategy, and this is a very rough word, but I think it's more accurate than drawing a progressive versus moderate line. I think candidates who relied on a turnout strategy overperformed those who relied on a cross-aisle strategy.
I think if you were to look at Colorado, I think that is completely incorrect.
And I'd like to say, I actually looked at the article that you shared in the group me. First of all, I can't read it because you shared a Wall Street Journal article and I'm not subscribed to them. But I did read the headline, and the examples that they seem to be basing this on are Georgia, Ohio, and Florida, right?
And they offer the counterpoints of Colorado being one of the main ones where it was a progressive-leaning governor who stuck to moderate themes.
Right. So, well, I'm not actually particularly interested in that kind of punditry because I think when we look at individual races, personality and more accurately personal attributes come into it much stronger. Like we said, Gillum and Abrams almost certainly suffered somewhat because of their race and because of the particular voter disenfranchisement strategies in both Florida and Georgia.
Completely agree. I was not saying that point was incorrect.
But you're looking at a case selection bias again. So you select Georgia, Florida, and Ohio as your examples, but there is a counterexample within Ohio. Sherrod Brown, our favorite politician, outperformed his polls, I believe, and beat his opponent. And
that's
out in Wyoming, we saw a Democratic governor who was very liberal for the area win the governorship.
Colorado?
Wyoming, didn't we?
Do you mean Wisconsin? What are you talking about?
Wyoming did have it.
Do you mean Kansas?
might have been Kansas.
Yeah, I was actually about to bring out Kansas here.
You're right. The Kansas governorship.
Kansas, I don't think should be brought into any larger case study because I would argue, and people who are from Kansas might be able to speak on this. I would argue that the primary reason the Democrat won was because of the third party.
I completely disagree. I think the primary reason that the Democrat won that, and not to turn this about Kansas, is because Trump personally stepped in, selected Kobach, got rid of their incumbent governor, who was not popular among mainstream Republicans, and the mainstream Republicans either then voted for that third party or, to quote them, bit the bullet and then voted for the Democrats. I think it has everything to do with Donald Trump. I think that Kansas is 100% Democrat right now in the governorship because of Donald Trump.
Do you think Trump is unpopular in Kansas? Is that what you're saying?
I think that among mainstream Republicans in Kansas, I think among mainstream Republicans nationally,
well, Kansas went heavily Trump.
I don't think there's any reason to believe that.
Yeah, Kansas went heavily Trump, which is why I think the Democrat winning there is kind of not a surprise.
Trump stepping in. I think Trump honestly stepped on the Republicans of Kansas' toes by, one, selecting or endorsing someone in the Republican primary who was not the incumbent governor, which has never been done before, and then Kobach won barely by 0.1 percentage point, and there was just not enough momentum for him to carry it into an election. I think that if you had maintained that incumbent, he would have steamrolled Kelly.
Ryan, I might be fully willing to believe you on all of your points if it weren't for Sharice Davids. I mean, they elected a lesbian Native American former WWE fighter, MMA fighter to Congress, and regardless of the demographics of that
We're
district,
making the argument this entire time that those local elections are far different and almost can't even be connected to the
cannot be compared in terms of that was the question of whether or not we were allowed to run the racial candidacy option, and that's not what we're debating anymore. Now we're talking about progressive versus moderate, and the progressive versus moderate ticket here. I mean, she ran an extremely progressive campaign for Texas. I will put that caveat. Sorry, Kansas. I will put the caveat for Kansas in there. But the idea that somehow just the sheer label of progressivism in these states is what swamped you. I'm even less convinced now that I know that the study came out of the Wall Street Journal. Especially since the Wall Street Journal has its own selection biases in this case. But if their case studies are coming out of Georgia and Florida, which, I mean, I think if we were to run a study on it, I think the disenfranchisement efforts, hands down alone, will have changed this election's outcome.
Florida just cannot be predicted.
Well, that too.
I don't think Florida. I think polling in Florida, you might as well just say we give up.
But I think Joe is ultimately the one who is most right here.
Isn't he always?
Is the idea that that it's really the nature of the race that they ran. When they ran a race that was about getting your base to turn out. That's what made the key difference, and that can be done depending on what state you're in, on what can be deemed a moderate or a progressive platform, especially in the more Midwestern sort of, what Trump used to call the sort of forgotten area of the country. You can run a decently progressive campaign on union rights, on the idea of returning, jobs to those areas that looks progressive, but at the same time is a totally winning strategy. Meanwhile, in order to win a race in Montana, where Tester regained his Senate seat.
That was the race I was thinking about.
Montana's Tester, which is a statewide race, if we're talking about only statewide systems. That area was only going to be able to be won by a candidate that was, again, pushing turnout over reaching party lines.
Okay, I mean, I think I agree with you, and again, I was only bringing up that point because it was what I had read this morning. But I think that there is a greater. Before I say anything dumb, I suppose. I think we should actually not move on to the next topic, but move this forward a little bit. Moving to 2020, are we allowed to speak on that, or is Joe going to be angry? Okay, no names, but how about strategies?
Sure, yeah.
We are talking about is strategies. Okay. I think, by the way, the biggest surprise of the night, at least for me, besides 7th, by the way, go Abigail Spanberger, big fan. Iowa, very interestingly elected, 3 Democrat?
3 out of 4.
Although the one Republican they failed to evict was the white supremacist.
Good job, Iowa. But at the same time,
endorsed by the Daily Stormer,
Yeah.
actually.
but at the same time, how about we talk strategy briefly, very briefly, talk strategy regarding what the Democrats should do for 2020, but also what the Republicans should do. Because I also think that Kansas is a good case study in that Donald Trump is not always the winning ticket. Yeah, I wanted the overall strategy because I will probably make the point that I don't think that Donald Trump's endorsements are the winning thing. Then I think that also shows him to be somewhat weaker than I think a lot of us believe him to be, or a lot of the Republican base believes him to be. Anyway,
Well, so for the Republicans, it's not so much a question of what their strategy should be, as it is what their strategy will be, which is they're going to have to run one way or another on the Trump administration. Obviously, I think we can all agree that Trump is going to seek a second term.
He's been campaigning.
He's a day after.
We're not in some fantasy land where Trump is resigning his post on the last day or whatever. So Trump is going to seek a second term, and I think the Republicans would be foolish not to try to run Trump in every state that he won in 2016.
do you think, based off of everything else, that someone is going to attempt to challenge him for the Republican nomination?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, there's already another guy who's filed in the Republican
and
Party.
that is?
Is
that Flake?
No.
No, this will be a joke candidate. The person to watch is Kasich. But shall we?
Everybody out of Ohio. Everyone out of Ohio is the candidate to watch.
There's a reason they call it the heart of it all. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that it's elected how many
But so
presidents?
for Republicans, I think the strategy is going to have to be based around Trump, right? It maybe not in every single individual race, but by and large, I think Republicans are going to have to run not as necessarily a referendum on the Trump administration, but as inextricably linked to him. They've proven that they're not going to, for instance, resist him they're not going to push back on him legislatively, so they don't really have a choice.
Joe, I will let you go in just a second, but I think that I would just like to repeat again my arguments regarding Kansas and a Trump-endorsed Republican through the nomination or through the primary and then into the actual election, and he got walloped. And yes, Joe, I understand that there was a large libertarian candidate who got 6.5% of the vote.
He wasn't libertarian.
A third party who was 6.5% of the vote, and Kelly won by something like 5.8% of the vote. So if you assume that every single one of those votes would have gone to Kobach, then yes, I think that holds up.
Well, listen, that's as may be, but Kemp also received Trump's endorsement, and he beat Abrams by a significant margin. If we're looking at individual races, I don't think the Republicans are deciding based on that.
That's fair, but I think Kansas is a particular. It speaks that there might be a weakness in Trump's popularity in the Midwest and West. And I think Sherrod Brown also shows that. I've said his name. Joe, please come in.
I will say I think that your case is weakened by the fact that Kobach himself had significant problems. But I agree in general.
Trump doesn't?
Not if you ask
Not among his base, yeah.
He remains quite popular in that region. But I'll go off your final point because that dovetails very well with my main argument. I think for 2020, parallel to the sort of progressive moderate shift that we've been talking about, there is a significant... Can I help you, Blake? The other major fight that's been going on within the Democratic Party is the Rust Belt strategy versus the Southern strategy. I've been saying this for like minutes, guys.
Guys, we're fine on time. Keep going.
And that is whether the Democrats should focus on reclaiming the quote unquote blue wall states to come back from the Trump election, or if they should abandon them and go for North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, Texas, try to move into new territory. And I think if there's one thing that 2018 has shown us, it is that the Sun Belt strategy is dumb. And the Democrats would be
I agree with you.
Stupid to pursue it, at least now. Democrats got very close, but ultimately did not win in Florida, Texas. May still win in Arizona, but too close for comfort.
Or Florida.
I said Florida. While winning.
No, they might win in Florida.
Oh, Maybe.
There's now a 15,000 discrepancy that's getting smaller every single
Well, we'll talk about
hour.
that when it happens. But the point is simultaneously winning convincingly in Wisconsin, Michigan, and the like. So, that's my position. This election has proven that the Northern strategy is much more viable.
Abe?
I think in 2020, Democrats are going to have to appeal to as many states as possible. Kind of like along the lines of what Joe said. We can get the popular vote, but what matters right now is the Electoral College for the presidency. And I think that means we're going to have to run in a white, progressive, but not too progressive, male candidate. I think, if not ideal, it's not what I would like to see, but I think that's how we're going to win, is a white guy. He's going to get the Midwestern states, and that's what we need.
To that point, Abe, most of the main Democrat pickups were not white straight men. They were women. They were women of color. They were women of different ethnic backgrounds. In fact, the high-profile straight white guys, Beto, Cordray, Nelson, all lost. I think that while I agree that we keep having to play into a Republican narrative that we have to elect a straight white guy, I think that only weakens the position that the Democratic Party is making significant gains in attracting suburban women by running women. Spanberger, Luria. I think that I don't necessarily think it needs to be a straight white guy, because I think that we proved on Tuesday night that you can run women.
All right, that's what we have for this episode. Again, apologies for the abrupt ending and cuts. It was necessary to preserve having the episode talk about something coherent. I just want to remind you before we sign off that the opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals who express them and not of the College of William & Mary. This podcast is associated, however, with the Podcasting Network and William & Mary, and we strongly encourage you to take a look at the other podcasts in our network. Have a good night, and we'll see you next time.